embedded among Jurassic rocks and indeed could not be separated save after a study of their enclosed organic remains. The person must note that the rocks themselves, according to their composition, cannot be separated into different categories. They constitute one homogeneous layer without the slightest sign of differentiation or disturbance. But this uniform layer is chopped up and arbitrarily separated into a number of artificial layers and columns and wedges, because evolution will not concede that the plants and animals of supposedly different evolutionary ages live contemporaneously side by side and were buried together in the same deposits. Well, just want to sum up what we say, a lot of scientific terms. I mean, the point's the point that when we're talking about science, you can't argue with science. If there's gravity and you throw something off a roof and it falls down, you can't philosophically argue with it. Gravity is gravity. Fine. Science is science. But again, science is science, but not theory is science. Just because they give a diagram or it's in a textbook and they say, this is what we think, you have to think, well, you think that, but do you have any proof for it? So proof is in the pudding. True science is proof, or we can just clinically observe it ourselves. But if they're just thinking what's happened, 10 million, 100 million years ago, there's no proof for this. We have to use a critical eye and just to understand that if this is trueness, and that means if science is true, then fine. Religion and truth have no argument. Religion and science is, if science is true and the religion is true and Judaism of course is true, then they are much not only compatible but complementary. I want to thank you very much for listening and hope you learned a lot today. Thank you. Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabados of Delmar, and today we're going to talk about a very interesting thing. I know it's actually in the news many times that the Bible versus a religion, sometimes they call it versus science. And they try to say, is it one or the other? And of course, that here on the Jewish View, we always say it's both. You surely can have science, which I don't think anybody can contest, but you could also have religion, and you don't have to make a choice between one or the other. And in light of that, there's actually a very interesting, it actually came out with a new book, and that's why I wanted to, of course, see something interesting. I want to share it with the viewers of the Jewish View. And Science, Art, and Modern Life in the Light of the Torah, where this actually conferences try to integrate, because really people try to divide between science and religion. So this conference tries to relate science and religion, and that's what we're going to talk about. There's really many issues that they were talking about, but I thought this one would be very, very interesting, how prayer and faith affect health. So you go to a doctor, well, here's an antibiotic, here's a medicine, here's a this, different kind of drugs. They don't say, go to the synagogue or go pray, but how much is effect? That's why here's a classic example of how much religion and science, here is medical science, can be integrated and to have a good effect. So without further ado, this is a talk from Rabbi Twersky, who's a MD. He's very, very recognized in Pittsburgh, that he's one of the biggest doctors, a psychiatrist, and has helped many, many people. He's worked actually in a Catholic hospital, St. Francis Hospital in Pittsburgh. And in any case, you have the highest regard for him, even though he's got a bigger, whiter beard than I have. I mean, he looks like he is a rabbi, but he's also an MD. and he's one of the biggest doctors really on staff over there. So that's an interesting story in its own right, but in any case, right now we'll just get to the idea. Repeated studies leave little doubt that prayer has a salutary effect on recovery from illness. What is not as clear is the mechanism whereby this effect occurs. Religionists have no problem in attributing the effect of prayer to divine benevolence, God's responding to prayer. They struggle, however, with the problem of how a person's prayer can cause God to act differently than he would have without the prayer. It is a tenet of faith that God does not undergo any change. Those who do not ascribe to divine intervention say that the serenity and reassurance brought about by prayer are responsible for its effects. That emotions can affect disease and recovery is no longer debatable, and the mechanism whereby this occurs has essentially been elucidated. The effect of others praying for the patient can be similarly explained. However, the studies that show salutary effect of prayers for a patient, even when the patient is unaware that he is being prayed for, are more difficult to explain. The effect of emotion on sickness and health. Ancient medicine alternated between priestly and lay therapies. Some 2,500 years ago, in ancient Greece, were known for the curative temples in ancient Greece were known for the curative temple sleep. And there is no reason to doubt the veracity of the cures that were reported. As scientific medicine evolved, cures due to other than medical intervention were attributed to the placebo effect. There is abundant anecdotal evidence of cases of serious diseases where people recovered with no medical treatment or where medical treatment was rejected. In the mid-20th century, there began to be some serious investigations into conditions that were referred to as psychosomatic. That is, there was demonstrable physical pathology attributable to emotional causes. It was widely assumed even by the most avowed scientific physicians that some cardiovascular or gastrointestinal disorders were stress-related. Therefore, relaxation by one method or another became a regular component of a treatment regimen. Gradually, a mind-body-spirit concept developed. It was only logical that diseases of emotional etiology correspond to emotional changes and psychological therapy. Following the discovery a number of years ago of endorphins, it was found that there are endorphin receptors these chemicals can hitch onto not only in the brain but in the gastrointestinal tract as well. This might be the vehicle then by which emotions can affect the digestive system. More recently, endorphin receptors have been found in the T cells, which are the lymphatic cells responsible for the production of the antibodies of the immune system. So there is speculation that the immune system may also be under the sway of the emotions. We have a field now known as psychoimmunology, which suggests that even cancer may indicate a failure of the immune system to recognize and destroy cancerous cells, and that cancer might therefore fall into the categories of diseases having psychosomatic component. There has been a resistance to accepting of psychological causes for pathology, and there are still stalwart scientists who dismiss etiologies other than those that can be demonstrated in the laboratory. However, the evidence for the role of emotion in health and disease has been overwhelming, and the mind-body-spirit concept is now widely accepted. More than half of the medical schools in the United States now offer courses in spirituality and medicine. Resistance to new ideas in medicine is hardly unique. In the mid-19th century, 50% of patients undergoing major surgery died of sepsis post-operative infection. Suspecting that bacteria were the cause of death, Dr. Joseph Lister advocated antiseptic surgery using carbolic acid. His suggestions were met with great resistance. In more recent times, despite rather convincing evidence, there was significant resistance to discovery that Helicobacter pylori was a cause of peptic ulcers. The abundant anecdotal evidence of the efficacy of prayer should suffice to give it more consideration. A number of students, albeit imperfect ones, indicate that prayers can have a salutary effect. Anyone who chooses not to believe this will find reasons for rejecting it. Obviously, both disruptive and salutary effects of emotions and etiology can be entirely the result of emotional factors rather than divine intervention. Now we'll talk about praying for the sick. Meditation has been shown to change brain activities, effect on the immune response. People who forgive easily are psychologically healthier than those who hold grudges, and consequently they may be physically healthier. But this proves nothing about prayer on religion. Certainly Judaism recognizes the value of prayer, and we regularly pray for divine healing. It is not unusual on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, to see physicians in the synagogue queuing up to submit names for Mishabeach, which are prayers for the sick. We traditionally ask saintly people to give their blessing for recovery. It is because we believe in the power of prayer that there is disagreement among halakhic authorities, Jewish law, whether it is permissible to pray for the death of someone who is suffering very badly. Some authorities forbid this as a corollary of the prohibition against physically hastening death. A poll showed that 72% of Americans believes that prayer is effective and would welcome a conversation with a physician about faith. Religious people in particular would be reassured to know that their doctor prays. A rabbi friend of mine suffered an acute gallbladder attack 3 days before Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, when we remember about the destruction of the temple. When the doctor told him that he wanted to operate the next day, the rabbi asked if it were possible to postpone the surgery until after Tisha B'Av, because this was a period of mourning which was not propitious for success. The doctor said, "The same God that will guide my hands 4 days from now will guide them tomorrow." The rabbi responded, "If you invoke God's help, you can operate whenever you wish." And he remained in an upbeat mood prior to surgery. One Hasidic rabbi, a relative of mine whose blessing was assumed to have resulted in a recovery from a serious illness, actually dismissed his role in the cure. "Look," he said, "I've given a blessing to hundreds of people. If one person recovers, I'm a miracle worker." Anecdotal data abounds. There are confirmed cases of spontaneous regression of cancer, but the cause and effect of prayer in these cases cannot be proven. As an intern, I was called to administer an intravenous injection to a man who suffered a cardiac arrest during an orthopedic surgery. The surgeon went into the patient's chest and started up the heart again. When the patient awoke from the anesthesia, he discovered a bandage on his chest and found that he had undergone a cardiac arrest. The nurse told me that the patient was not cooperating with the doctor's regimen and was very depressed. When I administered his medication, the patient said to me, "Are you a rabbi?" When I told him I was, he said, "I'm a Catholic. Can you say a prayer for me?" Thinking that he would probably be familiar with Psalm 23, I recited it with him. When he came to, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me," he began crying. He thanked me for praying with him. The following day, out of curiosity, I stopped in to see him. The nurse told me that he was in much better spirits. He greeted me with a smile. "Hi, Doc," he said. Then he said, when we said that part about walking in the valley of the shadow of death, I realized that that meant me. When my heart stopped, I was walking in the valley of the shadow of death. I was dead. What will happen if it stops again when there's no one around to restart it? That's why I was so depressed, out of fear of dying. But now I realize that the way I lived my life, I was with God. I was a police sergeant, and I helped many people. So I think that when I die, God will be with me. I am no longer afraid of death. You know, Doc, that prayer beat the heck out of the medication." Was the patient's improvements God's response to the prayer, or did the lifting of his depression make him more hopeful and cooperative? Inasmuch as most research studies on the efficacy of prayer have little more scientific validity than anecdotes, let me share another anecdote with you. A child was brought from Israel to the Pittsburgh Allegheny General Hospital because it had the only neurosurgeon in the world who would operate on the girl's particular brain tumor. The surgeon informed the parents of the possible side effects that would result from the surgery, and they consented. Yeshiva and kollel students, rabbinical students, were reciting prayers in the surgical waiting room. Then the surgeon's assistant came out and reported that the deficits would be even more serious than expected. The child was going to have paralysis on one side of the face and would not be able to open her right eye. Again, the parents consented to go ahead with the surgery. After the surgery, the child came to the recovery room much more quickly than had been anticipated and opened both eyes. The surgeon said, "This can't be. I know that I severed the nerve going to the right eye." He then wrote on the patient's chart, "Patient opened her right eye due to the Jewish God." There are countless articles on the efficacy of prayer on health. It was the subject of the cover story of November 2003 issue of Newsweek, and it became the topic of many lively discussions. Some of the most prestigious medical schools have undertaken research in this area, but this research has many obstacles. What constitutes prayer? Does it make a difference who prays for whom? Among the myriad factors that can affect health, how can one ascribe recovery to any one factor? Is it possible that the positive emotional factor of knowing that someone is praying for you can be operative? Is it possible that truly scientific research, such as a double-blind study, can be carried out on two groups of patients with similar illness, one of which is prayed for without the knowledge of the patients, while the other is not prayed for? How can we be certain that no patients in either group are praying for themselves? Incidentally, there are some particular vitriolic responses to one of the studies of the salutary results of multi-religious group prayers. How dare you contend that God responds to the prayers of infidels? What is the Jewish attitude towards prayer by non-Jews? We believe that God is absolute, uncompromised unity. It is idolatry for us to add anything or anyone to Hashem, God. For non-Jews who recognize God, adding something to Him is not idolatry as long as they do not worship idols. So the prayers of non-Jews who pray to God may indeed be answered. Recent studies purporting to show the effects of prayer have been criticized for being methodologically unsound. The only study that can claim validity is one that shows that people who regularly attend church or synagogue live significantly longer than those who do not. It has also been shown that regular worshipers have a lower incidence of depression than non-worshipers. They also have a higher rate of smoking cessation and exercise. These salutary effects can easily be attributed to social and psychological factors among worshipers rather than to divine favor. One study that claims to be a double-blind study concludes that the group of prayed for patients in the intensive care unit were 5 times less likely to require antibiotics and 3 times less likely to have any pulmonary edema, and that no one in this group required intraarticular intubation or respiratory support. This study queried by why God did not respond equally to all the prayed for patients. There will always be advocates for and critics of any emotionally laden subject. In the case of prayer, the advocates claim that withholding prayer denies the patient of a potent recovery, and that many, if not most, patients desire to be prayed for, but are reluctant to raise the subject with their doctor because of the risk of ridicule. Prayer advocates suggest that when a doctor takes a patient's comprehensive history, he should ask the patient whether he or she wished to be prayed for. They claim that a majority of patients would feel even more secure if the doctor also offered to pray with them. Critics, on the other hand, say that a doctor suggesting prayer confuses the doctor-patient relationship. Is a doctor going to rely more on prayer than on medical treatment? It might cause the patient to think if prayer is necessary, then the doctor must not have any effective medical treatment for me. Moreover, if the patient does not require, will he lose faith in God or think himself undeserving? Is it possible that an overly zealous doctor could impose religious beliefs on his patient? One person even commented if he found out that his doctor prayed for him, he would sue him for malpractice for applying a treatment for which he did not give consent. How does praying for the sick work? Should prayer be researched scientifically? Some say that God does not belong in the laboratory. It is heresy to subject God to scientific scrutiny. Setting aside scientific inquiry into prayer, there are many theological questions to be answered about prayer. How can prayer make God change his mind? There is not much problem when a person prays for his or her own recovery, because sincere prayer can elevate a person spiritually. Thus, if it's not that God has changed his mind, but rather that the person has changed for the better and now merits healing. How, though, can the prayer of another person praying for the patient be effective when the patient did not become more spiritual or better in any way? This would imply that prayer can make God change his mind, which is incompatible with the principle that God never changes in any way. While we may not understand the mechanism of prayer for others, Psalm 145 makes us believe it is effective. God does the will of those who revere him. Who should pray for the sick? From the Talmud, it is evident that some people's prayer may be more effective than others. The Talmud tells the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who prayed for his son's recovery, but his prayers were not effective. When he asked Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa to pray for his child, Rabbi Hanina's prayer was effective. Rabbi Yochanan's wife asked him, "Does that mean Rabbi Hanina is a greater Torah scholar than you?" Rabbi Yochanan replied, "No, not at all. I am like a minister in the king's cabinet, so when I come only when summoned for an appointment. Hanina is like a servant. He can come and go into the king's chamber whenever he likes." The Talmud says that a sick person should seek counsel from a Torah scholar to intercede. Yet we ask, why should another person's prayer be effective? Rabbi Elimelech Lezentz gives a wonderful explanation. He says that God conducts the world according to absolute principles of justice. For reasons now known only to himself, one day God decrees that Reuven, for example, should suffer. Reuven shares his distress with Shimon. Shimon is so devoted to Reuven that he begins to suffer pain because Reuven is suffering. God, however, never decreed that Shimon should suffer, so Shimon is suffering unjustly. The only way to remove Shimon's suffering is to cure Reuven. Therefore, Rabbi Elimelech said, if you feel strongly enough about someone else, then pray for him. That is how your prayer can help him recover. Should a doctor pray for his patients? We return to our original assumption that people want to be well regardless of what restores their health. But a doctor may feel uneasy asking a patient whether he wishes to be prayed for. There is no reason, however, why the doctor, like any other person, should not pray for his patient. I don't believe that informed consent is necessary for prayer, especially since this is the one treatment with no side effects. If a doctor wishes to pray for the patient in the traditional way, by inserting the names of the patient and his mother into the daily or the Sabbath prayer, he should take the names from the information sheet that the patient fills out on his first visit. The concept of prayer that seems to differ from the traditional understanding is the idea that there can be indirect transmission of thought and feeling. In other words, a person may be the recipient of another person's prayer without consciously knowing it, and this unconscious knowledge may be effective. This concept falls into the realm of parapsychology, which has its proponents and its opponents. Many people have had inexplicable awareness of things happening at a distance. I do not understand physics, but I read that in 1964, John Stuart Bell, a physicist at Harvard, introduced the concept that if distant objects have once been in contact, a change thereafter in one causes an immediate change in the other, no matter how far apart they are. Once subatomic particles have been in contact, they always in some sense remain connected, so there can be ubiquitous non-local effects. Rare and exotic circumstances may be connected with inexplicable awareness. For example, someone flew home from Israel because her mother was gravely ill. At one point during the flight, she heard her name being called. She happened to have noticed what time this happened. She looked around, but there was nobody on the plane who could have known who she was and could have called her. After she landed, she found out that this was precisely the moment that her mother had died. How such transmission can occur is unknown. According to Kabbalah, there is a kind of unification of the entire universe. Nothing, not even inanimate objects, can exist without a nucleus of God within them. The Kabbalah says that because God is omnipresent, He fills and encompasses all worlds. There are bounds of greater and lesser intensity among everything in the world. We are separate entities only because of the boundary of our physical bodies, but spiritually all the universe is one. According to this way of thinking, there may be no qualitative difference whether one prays for oneness, oneself, or others pray for him, because we are all one big self. There is another concept that prayer consists of surrendering to the divine will rather than supplicating for a cure. This is not as far-fetched as it may seem, because when we pray we say, "May it be your will." Essentially, this is an acceptance of God's will for whatever may be. There is no reason to believe that accepting God's will can result in a kind of serenity that may alleviate stress. Such an attitude of equanimity can thus relieve anxiety, and this may all play no small part in restoration of health. Finally, there is a prayer attributed by some to Maimonides for a physician to say. Businessmen regularly invoke God's blessing for success. Even people who buy lottery tickets utter a verbal or mental prayer. It thus certainly seems appropriate for a doctor to pray that God blesses his efforts to heal his patients. I think this is an important point over here that Rabbi Dr. Twersky, both together, you see, now you can see for yourself how he integrates rabbinical ideas together with his physician, his medical practice, and really, like we started off saying, the idea that science, and here it would be medical science versus religion, and many people don't combine the two. Yeah, but here we see that the Torah viewpoint, I think articulated by Rabbi Dr. Twersky, is the Torah view is the correct view, and that you can actually put medicine all together with religion together. We have a few more minutes, and here's an interesting book review, a Jewish guide to caregiving. Books about psychology and social work can sometimes be hard to read, but not this one. Backed up by many true stories, Naomi Brudner discusses caregiving in all its facets, with a special emphasis on the Torah underpinnings of the mind-body relationship developed by Bernie Siegel and others. Caring for a sick mother made her more aware of the need for incorporation of medical personnel. She hopes that her book will bring more love, forgiveness, faith, and joy into our lives and the lives of those we care for. The author is an American-born psychologist who has lived and worked in Jerusalem since 1978. She has produced tapes and books for children and adults and does provide counseling, teaching, and lecturing. An underlining theme throughout the book is the importance of loving the patient and treating him or her with dignity, respect, and kindness. She believes that the medical profession can sometimes be cold and unkind, egotistic, inconsiderate, and pessimistic. In a chapter on dealing with medical professions, she recommends researching the possibility of complementary medicine and the importance of getting a second medical opinion. I would have added a comment on the potential problems of a second opinion. The chapters People Are Not Vegetables and the chapter on Caring for Yourself are especially important. She emphasizes the vital necessity of accepting one's own physical and mental limitations and the need for relaxation and support system while caring for someone who is ill. The author describes instances where acute and loving observations of family members led to revealing errors in medical or nursing management or suggesting improvement. The book is full of practical suggestions such as preparing oneself physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually before visiting a sick patient. The reader is advised to plan in advance what subjects to discuss and is urged to smile at the other patients. A hug is worth a million words, and never forget that the apparently unconscious patient can understand and remember what had been said at the bedside. Rabbi Twersky writes that caring is required reading for anyone who serves in a caring role. Rabbi Zev Leff goes a step further by adding that this book is phenomenal in breadth and scope and should be read by everyone. And this is, again, just to conclude, this is an interesting book, if you can get it, Jewish Guide to Caregiving, which is together with, again, what we're talking about, Rabbi Twersky, Naomi Brudner, B-R-U-D-N-E-R, and from Feldheim Publications. It's an important book to read, how that not only is medicine, the drugs and the prescriptions important for the good of the patient, but also the human factor also. Thank you very much.